And I thought before I actually got into the talk, I would try to see how prepared you are for the talk. And basically, the first question is, how many people have taken a road trip? No, I've taken one. Got a pretty good number of people who know what the experience of going out on the road and seeing something. How about how many people have ridden a horse? Okay, well, this is an excellent group for this, because I think you'll get more out of it if you have a sense of what Henry Knox experienced. How about rode a rowboat? I've done that, cross a lake. How about, I'm sure we've all, living in New England, we know what marching, walking through deep snow is like, and cold winter days and all of that. And I think knowing that, I think will help all of us, to the extent we haven't before, imagine, which is what I consider the largest element of a travel tourist, or history tourist rather, to do. You want to try to have a sense of what it was like for people who were standing in the places you're now standing, such as this lovely location or any other historic location. What was it like to be those people? So knowing what it's like to take a road trip, to ride a horse, to row a boat, to walk through a snowy field, or in a blizzard, I think will help. So with that said, let's get on with the formal talk, and I hope you'll enjoy it. So, title is The Mysterious Disappearance of Sudbury from the Henry Knox Trail and the Magic of I Believe. With the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence coming up in just a few years now, and the 100th anniversary of the Henry Knox Trail in 2027, I'm here this afternoon to ferment a little revolutionary spirit and try and stir you folks of the Historical Society into setting right an ancient wrong done Sudbury. I want to thank your Executive Director, Rachel Robinson, for inviting me to speak today. I also want to thank Wayland Historical Museum Curator Kay Gardner-Westcott and Jane Siaka for their assistance in preparing a talk on this subject for the Wayland Historical Society this past spring, which very much got me started on this presentation. And I want to thank Ruth Ann Tomasini of the Framingham History Center, Michael Weishen of the Southborough Historical Society, Robert Kidd of the Horace A. Moses Scout Reservation, and Catherine Gaglioli of the Massachusetts Archives for all of their help and important contributions to my understanding of the Henry Knox Trail. I'm particularly glad to be giving this talk here in Sudbury, near the inspiration of Longfellow's Tales of a Wayside Inn, because it's the perfect place for me to tell the tale of the mysterious disappearance of Sudbury from the Henry Knox Trail. I like to end a talk where I began so that I'll know where I'm going and you'll know when I get there. So I'll begin by saying, let this be your call to arm. Hear, hear. It takes a bit of magic and imagination to make history come alive. But I was surprised to find in preparing this talk just how much of history is based on a bit of magic and imagination. Let me start then by advising you and cautioning you to remember that much of what we know as history and much of what I'll be talking about today has its basis in the expression, I believe. I'd estimate that over the 22 years we've lived in Wayland, I've driven past the Henry Knox marker trail marker at the intersection of Old Connecticut Path and Contituate Road, the old 5-pass intersection, over 30,000 times. It sits in the peninsula jutting out toward the traffic lights. In spring and summer, it's surrounded by flowers. Wayland's marker site is perhaps the nicest appearing site of the 61 marker sites on the Henry Knox Trail, which stretches from above Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York to Dorchester Heights in Boston. Keep in mind, there's no marker here in Sudbury. The trail was created by the states of Massachusetts and New York in 1927 to commemorate the British evacuation from Boston in March 1776. It was part of the national 150th anniversary celebration of the Declaration of Independence. In the winter of 1775-76, Henry Knox did the impossible almost like magic, and brought 58 cannon. One more was lost in the New York River and since recovered. A few weighing as much as 5,000 pounds from Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York to General George Washington besieging the British in Boston. Overnight on March 4th, 1776, Washington had the largest cannon brought up to the top of Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston. When the British woke up on March 5th and saw them magically appeared there, they pretty much just got on their ships and sailed out of Boston on March 17th, evacuation day. Freeing Boston of British troops was Washington's first success as commanding general. It was a sign stragglers had been waiting for to join the cause. It brought the 13 colonies together and directly led to the Declaration of Independence a few months later on July 4, 1776. News of Knox's feat of bringing the cannon that forced the British to leave Boston quickly spread throughout the colonies. Knox and his cannon train became the can-do inspiration on which the United States was literally founded. The Henry Knox Trail was created as a driving trail in the early days of the automobile. It makes a great road trip through parts of New York and Massachusetts, and frequently visited by tourists today, but with much besides historic sites to offer. You can read my 3 travel articles for suggestions of all there is to see and do along the trail. But the trip, of course, is also a way to imagine the passage of Knox's cannon train. My wife and I did the first part of our trip from Ticonderoga to Worcester in November, matching the time of year Knox began, and continued on a couple of extremely cold days in January to match the weather in which Knox finished his task. But a summer trip would be best for sightseeing. Even Fort Ticonderoga is only open from May to October. Nobody died. Before the Knox Trail was created, Knox's trip had been largely forgotten because nobody died. Nobody died to be remembered by family and friends left behind. It was a physically demanding trip of nearly 2 months in the middle of a particularly cold and snowy winter. The train of 40-plus oxen-drawn sleds crossed frozen lakes and rivers, through wilderness areas, and over mountaintops. Knox's route from Fort Ticonderoga spread out over 300 miles, but there were no battlefields, there was no fighting, and nobody died. The British Army didn't fight in winter. The King's troops were penned up in Boston, which was then a virtual island in Boston Harbor, attached to the mainland by a causeway. American troops surrounded it, although their number fluctuated. Knox had the weather to worry about, not the British. By the time the cannon train reached Albany, New York, word of its approach brought out crowds to watch the cannon pass. In western Massachusetts, it must have seemed like a parade. One cannon was even fired in a few of the towns as a demonstration. Knox had a notebook that was also a ledger of expenses. The 12-year-old son of a teamster who worked the trip along with his father as far as Springfield also kept a diary. But these, along with a small assortment of correspondence and random mentions in a few officers' journals, are the only contemporary references. David McCullough's book, 1776, does the best job I've read of presenting the few existing facts about the Knox cannon train. Since nobody died to be remembered, in the midst of the Revolution, Knox's trip itself was largely ignored. No one recorded the route, and most details of the trip were lost. As time passed in terms of popular recognition, even the evacuation of the British from Boston became secondary to Concord and Lexington, which got Longfellow's poem Paul Revere's Ride in 1860 and its own holiday, Patriots' Day, in 1894. Actually, it seems possible that neither the evacuation of the British from Boston or Knox's cannon train would ever have gotten much attention if it hadn't been for the class struggle between Brahmins and Irish, which was at its climactic point in the early 20th century. And this was really only because, as it happened, St. Patrick's Day is March 17th, the same date the British evacuated Boston in 1776. As the Irish population in Boston grew, so did their St. Patrick's Day celebrations. And the Irish working class were insisting on its being made a holiday. But the Brahmins, still in control of the state, weren't going to concede so easily. In 1902, on the anniversary of the British evacuation, in the heart of Boston's Irish community of Southie, and on St. Patrick's Day, the state dedicated the Dorchester Heights Monument honoring the evacuation. Chief Brahmin, United States Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, gave the keynote speech, and March 17th was declared Evacuation Day in the city. The Irish of Boston got the day off, but to this day, it's officially known as Evacuation Day, not St. Patrick's Day. 25 years later, in 1927, Massachusetts followed up the commemoration of Evacuation Day with creation of the Henry Knox Trail. In February 1776, Boston and the British were under siege, so Knox's mission ended at Continental Army headquarters in Cambridge. But with its increasing political power in 1927, the Irish community wanted its own neighborhood recognized and raised a legislative stink, insisting the trail should officially end on Dorchester Heights. The compromise was apparently to cite Cambridge as the end of the trail on the trail markers, but to place on Dorchester Heights an additional marker of the same design commemorating the resulting evacuation. Creating the Henry Knox Trail. The first problem in laying out one of the earliest heritage trails in the United States was finding it after 150 years. In April 1925, the Massachusetts legislature appropriated $500 to fund a special unpaid commission to search for the route in this Commonwealth over which General Henry Knox brought the guns and ammunition captured at Fort Ticonderoga to the camp of the Colonial Army at Cambridge in the years 1775 and 1776, and in connection therewith, to estimate the number of markers necessary to forever mark said route and the cost of the manufacture and erection of the same. The commission then solicited information from across Massachusetts where Knox might have passed and reported back to the legislature in December 1925 with a list of 26 proposed city and town locations. Here begins the tale of the mysterious disappearance of Sudbury from the Henry Knox Trail. In 1925, Sudbury, not Wayland, was one of the specifically listed towns in line to receive a marker. While at the time of the Revolution, Wayland had been part of Sudbury, that had changed in 1780. Following up in March 1926, the Massachusetts legislature resolved that the special commission, to be known as the General Knox Commission, was to purchase and supervise the erection of a suitable marker in each of the cities and towns on the route in this Commonwealth over which General Henry Knox brought the guns and ammunition captured at Fort Ticonderoga to General Washington at the camp of the Colonial Army in Cambridge. $6,000 was appropriated for this purpose with the intention that the markers be erected in 1926, the 150th anniversary year. And how and when did New York come to join the effort? New York doesn't seem to have taken up the idea until mid-1926. There aren't any known facts on the relationship between Massachusetts and New York regarding the trail, but at the time, the politically well-connected Pell family owned Fort Ticonderoga and had been restoring it as a public historic site. What tourist attraction wouldn't want a publicized trail starting on its doorstep? So it wasn't until late 1927, with a one-year delay after New York joined the project, before the markers were being installed.
Is this it?
On
right?
Sunday, November 6,
Share
1927,
screen? Oh,
Wayland was to unveil its Henry Knox marker. The Natick Bulletin on Friday, November 4th, 1927 advised Wayland, the General Henry Knox tablet that is to be placed by the state in Wayland will be dedicated Sunday afternoon, November 6th at 3 o'clock. It is to be placed on the Old Connecticut Path at its junction with Constituent Road. A cordial invitation is extended to the public to be present at the exercise of dedication, and a special invitation is given to the local chapter of DAR through Mrs. Nellie Rice Fisk, Regent of the Wayland chapter, DAR. Celebrations for these markers unveilings were common in the communities along the trail. So, just as the tricorn hat is unfamiliar looking to most eyes today, I find it hard to imagine living in the late 1700s. But inside of a fedora, it's easier to imagine life in the 1920s. Let's imagine living in 1927. 1927 was one of this country's big years. I highly recommend Bill Bryson's book, One Summer America 1927. Record floods drowned half the country. The weather was bizarre long before global warming, yet the American economy was booming. A booming stock market rose by 1/3 that year. Almost everyone had a telephone, and nearly half of American households had a car and a phonograph. Al Jolson sang on screen in The Jazz Singer, ending the age of silent movies, and outrageous murders dominated the headlines. Babe Ruth made a movie and hit 60 home runs, a record that would stand for 34 years. And Sacco and Vanzetti were executed. But around the world, flying was everything. Aviators were chasing one record or another, and many died trying. Then, on Saturday, May 21, Charles Lindbergh landed in Paris, the first to cross the Atlantic nonstop by airplane. And the world celebrated and celebrated and celebrated. It seems it was a parade for Lindbergh in every city across the country. He often flew from one parade to the next in the same day. Boston held a parade for him on July 22. Despite Prohibition, America knew how to celebrate in 1927, and with more leisure time, Americans were looking for any opportunity to get out of the house and celebrate. Now, let's imagine that Sunday afternoon's unveiling of Wayland's Henry Knox marker. A November afternoon, very much like today's. The Boston Globe reported that hundreds of automobile loads of people came to the exercises. Despite the fact, according to the Natick Bulletin, that snow, hail, and a cold northwest wind had sent the mercury falling. The Boy Scout Band of Marlborough gave several selections, closing with Star Spangled Banner, in which all joined. And since it was a Sunday, no doubt everyone would have been wearing their Sunday best. But people never went out in public then in less than a jacket and tie for men, and dress for women, and hats for all. By today's standards, this outdoor gathering would have been quite the formal affair. And then the speeches began. 2 police officers were detailed to close the road during the exercise, but I don't imagine there were any folding chairs. People must have been used to standing for hours. We've gotten pretty soft and impatient by their standards. Mrs. Nellie Rice Fisk, Regent of Wayland's Wayside Inn chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, gave the welcoming address. She extended thanks to Francis Shaw, owner of the land, for the privilege of placing it on such a site hard to equal, with the extended view to Wachusett and Monadnock Mountains on the west and the lazy Sudbury River between. It is a picture which few can fail to appreciate. Francis Shaw was one of the first wealthy people to build a country estate in Wayland. Over time, he put together an estate which neared almost 900 acres. I suspect the remnants of a stone wall along Old Connecticut Path leading to Shaw Drive mark the border of what was once his property. Today, tall trees surround the entire intersection to the marker site, and there isn't an extended view from any angle. Actually, the marker was moved to its present location on the west side of the intersection in 1977, when perhaps the traffic lights were installed. 50 years earlier, it was placed on a hill on the east side of the crossing, which I guess was leveled and replaced by the present retaining wall. Assuming there were no trees, from its location at the height of the retaining wall, Mrs. Fisk would have had her hard-to-equal view. Today, looking through the trees from this perch, you can just make out the hills in the distance. So imagine the crowd gathered around the base of this hill for the unveiling ceremony, looking up to the dignitaries surrounding the marker. On this wintry November afternoon, it seems likely that by the time the ceremony was finished, it would have started getting dark. It must have been cold and unpleasant out there. Think if this talk were held outdoors today. As to the location, the State Commission said markers were supposed to be placed where old roads intersected current state highways, and this site satisfied those specifications. I hope you all have in mind an image of this 1927 gathering for the dedication of Wayland's Henry Knox marker. And after today, I hope you'll find a moment to stop there sometime and imagine this scene. Next, according to the Natick Bulletin, Reverend William H. Brannigan of the First Parish Church offered the dedicatory prayer, followed by all giving the salute to the flag. The chapter of the DAR repeated in unison the American Creed. And the little 10-year-old twin daughters of Mrs. Hartley Johnson performed the unveiling, after which George Brogan, chairman of the Selectmen, accepted the marker from Edward H. Redstone, state librarian, one of the 3 Knox commissioners of the General Knox Commission. You'll want to remember that Edward H. Redstone, one of the 3 General Knox commissioners, actually presented the marker in Wayland. And here is where the magic of I believe begins. In the middle of all this, the newspaper reported that John H. Temple was introduced by Mrs. Fisk as borrowed from the town of Framingham and gave a most enthralling address on how the artillery was brought from Ticonderoga 150 years ago. At this point, I want to stress that this speech of Mr. Temple underlies the town of Wayland's historical understanding of the Knox Trail through Wayland, and this has been so ever since. The speech was printed in its entirety in the Natick Bulletin a few weeks after the ceremony and was reprinted again in the years after 1927. John Temple was a Framingham historian whose family had been in Framingham for many generations, and whose father, the Reverend Josiah H. Temple, wrote the book History of Framingham, which is still relied on by the Framingham History Center. Mr. Temple's speech was both an excellent summary of the Knox cannon train, as well as of his efforts to identify Knox's route through Framingham. But he said that given the importance Knox's effort played in the Revolution, it seems strange that so few records relating to these events have been preserved. I want you to keep in mind that his various conclusions were, by his own admission, based largely on general knowledge, framed by his intuition, and stated in terms of, I believe. He was making more of an argument than stating firm conclusions. But magic will have its way. As to Knox's path through Wayland, first Mr. Temple laid the groundwork. Mr. Malley tells me that the weight of the heavier cannon would be about 3 tons each. At least 2 pairs of oxen would be attached to each sled, and these would weigh not less than 3 additional tons. This would mean that steep hills must be avoided if possible, and that the route must lie over strong stone arch bridges or culverts, for no ordinary wooden bridge of that day would carry a weight of 6 tons or more. With this stated, he went on. When the artillery train moved forward, either as a whole or in sections to the camps and fortifications on either side of Boston, I believe it was taken through Edge Hill Road and Potter Street in Framingham and to the new bridge, Stone's Bridge, so-called, which was at that time the only strong stone arch bridge over the Sudbury River and is near the spot where Sudbury, Wayland, and Framingham join, and thence through Stonebridge Road into Old Connecticut Path, thence through Wayland, Weston, and Waltham to the Army headquarters at Cambridge. To repeat, he said that the cannon had to go over a stone arch bridge, and therefore they must have gone over Stone's Bridge because it, to quote him, was at that time the only strong stone arch bridge over the Sudbury River. Again, Mr. Temple said, I believe. And to be fair to him, there he was alongside Old Connecticut Path in Wayland, giving a speech standing next to Wayland's brand new Knox Trail marker. How could he have stood there and suggested otherwise? But 3 weeks earlier in Framingham, he gave this same speech at the unveiling of Framingham's Knox Trail marker. Except there, when he got to this point in the speech, he added, or it may have taken the route through what is now the village of Knobscott into Sudbury, and thence over Lanham Road and Bridge into Wayland and beyond. So he said in Framingham that Knox could have gone to Boston Post Road and not on Stone's Bridge and Stonebridge Road, bypassing Old Connecticut Path, where he stood giving his speech beside Wayland's new marker, and gone instead through Sudbury. This alternative makes even more sense in light of the fact that the General Knox Commission again listed Sudbury, not Wayland, in its final 1928 report signed by Commissioner Redstone, even though he signed this report just weeks after presenting the marker at the celebration in Wayland. The Henry Knox cannon train did have to pass somewhere through Wayland on its way to Cambridge, so Wayland should always have been on the list of towns to receive a marker. I just have no idea why a marker wound up only in Wayland and not also in Sudbury. I asked your executive director why, and she suggested that Wayland was a richer community. It was a state project, politics being politics. Now, let's focus on Temple's conclusion that the cannon train passed over Stone's Bridge. First, the bridge was actually named after the Stone family who lived on both sides of it. Mr. Temple specifically stated that Knox's route must lie over strong stone arch bridges or culverts, for no ordinary wooden bridge of the day would carry a weight of 6 tons or more. And Stone's Bridge, he believed, was at that time the only strong stone arch bridge over the Sudbury River. But it wasn't a stone bridge at the time of the Revolution, according to the Wayland Historical Society. It was a wooden bridge in 1776.
Okay.
In its 1976-2013 book, Wayland Historical Tours, the Wayland Historical Society said, it was believed that a stone bridge was here at the time of the Revolution. However, in fact, it had not been constructed until circa 1858. We can see that Captain Hurd's newly built bridge was a wood frame bridge because of payments for wood planking and bridge raising. Contrary to belief, it was this substantial wooden bridge and not a stone one that Colonel Knox crossed with his noble train of artillery. As to being substantial, I've read the invoices for wood, and they don't suggest to me anything that proves this 1776 wooden bridge was other than ordinary. If Mr. Temple had known that Stone's Bridge hadn't been made of stone at the time of the Revolution, would he have suggested that Knox had taken the hilly Stonebridge Road route? Temperatures in the Boston area in late January 1776 were in the single digits. The Sudbury River must have been solid ice passable over by the cannon anywhere along the way to Cambridge. So maybe the cannon didn't pass over Stone's Bridge at all. But it's understandable why the Wayland Historical Society may have been overly invested in the conclusion that Knox and the cannon passed over Stone's Bridge. Because by the time of writing Wayland Historical Tours, the Historical Society had played a substantial role in placing an original marker there, albeit a different form of marker. In 1967, a large granite marker inscribed Knox Trail, Fort Ticonderoga, New York to Cambridge, Mass., was discovered in the maze of tunnels beneath the State House. According to the Wayland Historical Society's 2004 book, Wayland A to Z, word circulated about the find among town historians. Wayland Historical Society's curator heard about it and contacted the state's bicentennial commissioner requesting the stone be donated to Wayland. She explained that the monument originally placed at Stone's Bridge in 1927 had mysteriously disappeared a long time ago, and a replacement, even a smaller one, would be welcomed. Back came a letter from the Revolutionary War Bicentennial Commission regarding this newly discovered marker. It is appropriate that it be used for the purpose intended, that is, to mark a site where General Knox and his cannon train passed on their way to Dorchester Heights almost 200 years ago. And so, this found marker was installed at the Wayland end of Stone's Bridge and is still there today. Of course, the fact is that no Knox marker was originally placed at Stone's Bridge in 1927. Again, Wayland wasn't even on the original list of 26 city-town marker sites. At the unveiling of Wayland's actual marker in November 1927, Knox crossing Stone's Bridge was merely Temple speculation, and apparently not his only possibility. As you can see, 26 city-town markers were ordered and paid for in 1927, and all 26 are accounted for. The 27th was the one the Southie community got for Dorchester Heights, none for Stone's Bridge, and no marker at all for Sudbury. So Stone's Bridge, that might not even have been mentioned by Mr. Temple if he hadn't been mistaken about it having been made of stone in Revolutionary times, has a marker because of the also mistaken belief that one was originally put there in 1927. Now, let's see how mistakes about history magically continue to expand through time. In 2016, Secretary of the Commonwealth, William F. Galvin, nominated Stone's Bridge for inclusion on the National Register of Historic Places. When transferring cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to General George Washington in Cambridge in the winter of 1775-76, General Henry Knox and his team of oxen passed over a wooden bridge at this crossing. A commemorative marker of this event has been installed at the east end of the bridge. So, because Mr. Temple mistakenly thought Stone's Bridge had been made of stone in 1776, and the curator of Wayland's Historical Society secured a marker because she mistakenly thought there had been a marker originally placed there in 1927, Secretary Galvin mistakenly recommended Stone's Bridge for inclusion on the National Register of Historic Places. And like magic, on January 17, 2017, Stone's Bridge appeared in the National Register of Historic Places. And there's still no marker in Sudbury. But could Sudbury have said no to receiving a marker? Why would a town have refused a marker? Who wouldn't have wanted to be part of a state-sponsored tourist attraction? And in December 1925, the commissioners had reported back to the legislature that they personally had traveled from town to town and found a very keen interest on the part of local government officials in having the route of this expedition marked. Cars and the concept of tourism were relatively new in 1927. Despite the commissioner's assurance to the legislature to the contrary, maybe not everyone saw the potential and future benefit of being part of something bigger. While most towns celebrated receiving the Knox Trail marker, In Marlborough, as late as January 1930, they didn't want theirs. Mayor Winfield Temple of Marlborough, he must have been related to Framingham's John Temple, begrudgingly accepted the marker because there did not appear to be anything else to be done. He finally stuck it on city property because the trustees of the library wouldn't have it. The Boston Globe reported the mayor saying, "I am not satisfied after considerable investigation that General Knox actually passed through the city, and I do not feel under the circumstances that any official notice should be taken of the marker." So, no celebration. But today, it's on Main Street in Marlborough Center and is the number 7 stop in the 2019 The Museum in the Streets project, with no question expressed whatsoever that Marlborough was on Knox's Cannon Trail. Oh, and where did the Cannon train pass through Wayland? Keep in mind that no one really knows. I believe Knox originally expected the Cannon train would go straight into Cambridge along the old Boston Post Road through Sudbury. But when he went ahead to Cambridge on January 18th to notify Washington of the train's approach, the decision was made to stop it in Framingham, out of reach of any possible British strike, to await further orders. The cannon had all arrived in Framingham by January 25 and were probably repaired and fitted with wheeled carriages while waiting there. Mr. Temple was looking for one route. I believe that when the cannon were deployed from Framingham weeks after their arrival, they likely had local teamsters that took the most direct route to a cannon's deployed position. More than likely, some of the lighter cannon crossed Stone's Bridge and went along Old Connecticut Path, heading for Cambridge and the Charlestown end of Boston Harbor. Wayland A to Z recites a typical Knox Trail anecdote. A Cutting family journal, the Cutting family lived at Maidstone Farm when Knox came along Old Connecticut Path, indicates they heard the caravan coming and invited the men up the hill for a meal. But if a cannon was headed to Dorchester Heights, it probably went a more direct route. Interestingly, Sudbury's Wayside Inn may have been one of the few spots on the old Boston Post Road that Knox passed, but not the cannon train. When Knox went ahead to Cambridge in mid-January, I believe he likely followed the old Boston Post Road past the Wayside Inn to Army headquarters. When he got back with Washington's orders to divert the cannon into Framingham, he could probably have found the train spread out over much of the western suburbs. Keep in mind that the 80-plus oxen, horses, and equivalent number of teamsters and soldiers would all have needed to be sheltered and fed. No one farmer inn along the way would have been able to handle this burden each night. When the various spread out teams got the word to divert into Framingham, they each would have found the most direct route into town. I guess it's into the city now. Framingham changed. Mr. Temple, who again was thinking only about one route, proposed that the train entered Framingham off the Boston Post Road down Hager Street in Marlborough. This perhaps could have been where Knox reached the most forward team on his return from seeing General Washington. As Mr. Temple suggested, the cannon possibly left Framingham on Sudbury's Lanham Road, the train would have missed going past the Wayside Inn, both coming and going. But perhaps Knox caught up to the lead team overnighting at the Wayside Inn. Either way, the cannon would have passed through Sudbury. We're only a few years away from the 250th anniversary of Henry Knox's cannon train, November 2025 to March 2026, and the 100th anniversary of the Henry Knox Trail in 2027. This is the time to correct Sudbury's omission from the trail. There are precedents for moving the trail and adding markers. New research got some of the markers near the New York-Massachusetts border moved in about 1975. Additional markers have also been added more recently in Crown Point, New York, and Roxbury, Massachusetts. In line with John Temple's alternate suggestion in 1927, combined with mine today, the Knox's cannon train followed multiple routes out of Framingham, Sudbury should petition the legislature to finally receive its rightfully entitled marker, an additional marker, and I suggest it be located consistent with the General Knox Commission's original guidelines at the corner of Landham and Boston Post Roads. Doesn't it look great in this simulation? This is a perfect project for the Sudbury Historical Society and the perfect time to get it done. Let this be your call to arm. Thank you and good afternoon. Sure.
Where that picture is now, the Sudbury Historical Commission tried to put a marker on that side and it was not allowed. We had to take the marker we had and move it to the left.
Well, I didn't investigate that. And we can find an alternate site for a new marker, but what Sudbury should have one.
I agree, but I don't think it can be put there because I fought to have one put there. And I have changed. No, it's a year ago.
No, recent, yeah.
Just a year ago.
We'll move it a little further down then. I'll redo the picture. Oh, thank you.
I heard the version that you gave to Wayland Historical last spring. I like this version better because it brings Sudbury fully into it. I hadn't really thought about the Knox Trail before. I live on Pelham Island Road, so I've thought a lot about crossings of the river and connection to Old Sudbury and New Sudbury. Something that always bothered me before about the Knox Trail of going over Stones Bridge, and I had never put it together, which you did, about it was a wood bridge anyway, is it always seemed crazy that they would go across that bridge deep into Happy Hollow and then try to get 6-ton cannons up the other side. I mean, that's crazy. I have a friend 20 years ago who kept draft horses and worked as a forester for federal, state, and local conservation areas. And he would, great, he'd go in and do forestry. His horses would pull things out. You couldn't even tell they were in there, which is why they used him. But he always said that he would never accept a job until he went and walked the site completely to see what his teams were going to be up against. Because he always said his teams, if they had too heavy a load and too much of an incline, they'd pull until their heart bursts. They wouldn't stop. And that's a Teamster view. And I can't imagine Teamsters thinking, you know, we'll go down in Happy Hollow and then try to come up that other side. I mean, that other side is really very steep.
Now they replaced all the Teamsters who started out at Fort George, actually, Lake George, in Springfield. So the New York ones went back. They had gone through the whole Berkshire, mountains and had to, lower these sleds, on ropes and pulleys to keep them from, going down. So, but I think the amazing part about this whole trip is that nobody did do in advance, really. Nobody figured it out in advance. This thing worked out with a guy who was basically, Henry Knox was a bookseller. He had a bookstore. He was a big guy. And he was a, very, I think, outgoing 25-year-old. When I think of Henry Knox, I think of Rob Gronkowski. I don't know if you have in mind, but to me, the image of the two of them, especially when he was, back in his full playing, bulked up years, those two probably, could have been brothers at the time. So, but he didn't have any experience. That's why, the idea, somebody just getting on a horse in Cambridge and riding all the way to Fort Tygon Road. Basically, he could not have, in his lifetime, Henry Knox could not have been on a horse more than, a couple of hours at a time. He had no need for that kind of, riding experience. So every aspect of this trip was a magical, impossible thing. And so, did anybody wind up going up that trip? Maybe they didn't know where they were going. I think a local Teamster, which they should have gotten when they were in Framingham, probably would have said, hey, I don't want to go that route, and wouldn't have taken that route. But, if the river wasn't frozen that day or whatever, who knows what somebody would have done. It was a necessity. You had to get these cannon where they finally were designated. And the plans for doing that were a little unclear to Washington at any of this point, Washington wasn't sure he'd even get the cannons. Suddenly, Henry Knox, in his original, letters, clearly was intending to just bring them all straight back into Cambridge. So the fact that Henry Knox rode ahead and Washington said, well, we thought about it, why don't you park them in Framingham? No, this is just, everything was happening on the spot. So there you go.
One other little twist on this is that the idea of it had to go over Stone Bridge, and of course it wasn't. So there's weight being considered, although that's in the 20th century when that weight is being considered. But a small deviation to this is, yes, coming up from Framingham, coming across Potter Road to Landham, going down Landham Road instead of on down to Stones Bridge. But instead of continuing on Landham all the way to Boston Post Road, because at that time, Boston Post Road didn't go straight to Wayland Center. You'd have to go all the way up quite a ways to go across, unless there's a different fording spot. Well, there is a different fording spot, and that is where now is Pelham Island Bridge, which became Farm Bridge, was known to be a fording spot. And there's a very interesting map that Wayland Historical has, 1794, drawn of Eastern Pelham Island by John Goodnow. And if you look at the illustration of it, it's got like flat stones all the way across. And it was known, Hudson pointed out, that was a fording spot. No worry about weight at all. You're going on stones over a fording spot. And going Pelham Island Road off of Landham, really level. It'd be going across the major hunt farm all the way over to the pond. 3 of the hunts were Revolutionary War soldiers. On the other side was Bent. He was killed. That's his farm there. So it's also quiet and big farms and lots of cooperation for this kind of effort, it would seem like. So it just seems like another possibility of going that way. It also is shorter than going all the way up,
Yeah, well, as I said, I think the local Teamsters would have figured out the best way to do it. And, certainly, any of the possibilities is, Henry Knox did a diary, but he really stopped writing in it by the time he got to Springfield. So, there's no, and to be fair to him, Boston Post Road was the established road. And I'm sure a guy who'd never probably left Boston before was on Boston Post Road going out and would have expected to go back, whatever Boston Post Road was, because, to make your own rules would have been difficult for somebody who had no idea what Wayland's topography might or might not be. But when Washington diverted the cannons and had them all parked in Framingham and turned it over, Henry Knox, Henry Knox was done. He went back to Cambridge, dealt with whether going to Dorchester Heights or whatever the deal was. And, I'm sure Washington had some local supervision that would have gotten the cannons pushed around Boston. Some of them went to Cambridge, the Cambridge side, some of them went, by the causeway, and only the biggest ones were eventually dragged up on March 4th to the top of Dorchester Heights so that they could be seen by the British. Actually, on March 4th, they were brought up to the top of Dorchester Heights, but in order as a sort of diversion on March 3rd, 2nd and 3rd, I believe, they fired from Cambridge and from the causeway. They fired a bunch of rounds of cannonballs into Boston, not really to do any damage, but just to distract the British into thinking, look in this direction, something's going to go on over here. And then the night of March 4th, they sort of had put up some barriers so they couldn't be seen, and 4,000 guys shuffled these cannons up and put them in place. Now, some people have asked me, they must have fired those cannons up on top of Dorchester Heights. Well, it seems pretty clear that they never actually fired the cannons on Dorchester. I'm not even sure the cannons worked. The cannons they brought back from Fort Ticonderoga, when Knox looked at them, they had been sitting there unused for about 20 years. They were pretty rusted. It would have taken, if they ever wound up actually being fired, somebody had to have spent a fair amount of time, sanding them down, getting them ready to be fired again. And maybe that happened in Framingham, but they, you don't want to. I don't want to take away from this whole thing, but the British looked up and saw these cannons. They were already about to leave Boston anyway. They'd planned to leave. They sent a letter to England in the fall asking if they could go, but by the time the mail got back, it took 6 weeks to get back. It was too late to actually pack up and leave Boston. They didn't consider Boston to be strategically, that important. They wanted to eventually get down to New York, which they thought was far more relevant to the whole revolutionary thing. So they got trapped in Boston. They really were just waiting out the winter. I think it was more a matter of pride that they even made a resistance to moving out of Boston when they saw these cannon up there. So the British, wrote back to London. They said, "Oh, they put these cannon up there. They must have had 14,000 people working miracles overnight to put these cannon up there. We were overwhelmed. We would have been overwhelmed." In effect, the American soldiers probably had 4,000, actually active soldiers available. Wouldn't have been too many more because at the end of winter, they'd had a lot of people in the end of the year who had discontinued their stay. Their 6-month enlistment had run out in January. They were basically very short of personnel at the beginning of the year and were just trying to ramp up again by April. So it was a public relations thing on both sides. The British didn't want to be embarrassed. The Americans wanted to claim a big victory so that they could get these other colonies to sign up and be part of this whole deal. So, the original public relations, took place here in Boston as part of the American Revolution.
So we have a question from the chat. How many of the original cannons exist and where are they located?
Well, there's one cannon that supposedly fell in the river, around Albany. That supposedly a cannon was recovered and brought up to Fort Ticonderoga and is now in Fort Ticonderoga. And they tell you it was one of the original Henry Knox cannons, but that this one had gotten lost in the river. And I've read one source that says, no, Knox didn't lose any cannons. This must have been lost when they were returning the cannons, not actually from his original. So there is one cannon you can see up at Fort Ticonderoga that says that it was one of the original cannons, and maybe it was. As far as the rest are concerned, well, it's not clear where they actually wound up. Most of them would have been dragged off to New York and whatever else, to the extent they were usable, or kept around Boston to keep the area safe. But they still needed the cannons. And what happened to them? Well, it's not. I don't think anybody knows what actually happened to any of the other cannons, and I don't think there's anybody who has any of the other cannons to display and say. Now, if you go down to Cambridge, to Cambridge Common, you will see a number of cannon sitting on Cambridge Common. Those are cannons that were recovered pretty much out of the harbor that the British, dumped on their way out. They couldn't take everything with them, so they I think they chiseled them so they wouldn't fire. I don't know if they could ever be fixed, but they dragged them out of the harbor, and now they're sitting in Cambridge Common. So you can get a contemporary cannon, you can see it sitting there, but the ones that Knox brought, aside from the one that may be in Fort Ticonderoga, there's one there, but maybe a Knox cannon. I don't think anybody knows what happened to the rest of the cannon.
Any other questions? Anyone else?
Well, thank you all.
Yeah.
I enjoy talking to people who are interested in history.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. Please feel free to look around if you haven't looked around lately, and we're here if anything in the gift shop strikes your fancy. So next 2 weeks from now, December 3rd, is our 4th annual Festival of Wreaths. So we have a lot of wreaths that'll be donated to us from businesses and local artisans that are for sale. So please feel free to come by that day on Saturday.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Well, thank you for coming.
Yeah. So thank you. So let me turn this off. So did you already